When World War II ended in 1945, one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history had finally come to an end. Europe was in ruins. Cities had turned to ash. Millions were dead. Nazi Germany had surrendered, and international tribunals were being prepared to prosecute war criminals. But the last bullet fired on the battlefield wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much larger struggle. Because this time the targets would not be chosen at the front lines, but inside laboratories. The Cold War, taking shape between the United States and the Soviet Union, was not simply a military standoff. It was a battle for ideological dominance and technological supremacy. Nuclear weapons, spy satellites, rocket technology, even experiments aimed at controlling the human mind. The wars of the future would be won with knowledge, and whoever held that knowledge could reshape the fate of the world. That is exactly when the American government made one of the most controversial, yet strategically calculated, decisions of the post-war era. The scientific expertise of Nazi Germany, especially its advanced military and space technology, could not be allowed to fall into Soviet hands. Documents seized in Germany mattered. Rocket plans mattered. Scientific notes mattered. But the truly critical asset was something else entirely. The people who created that knowledge. And so a highly classified program was launched, Operation Paperclip. This was an operation the public was never meant to hear about, designed to bring hundreds of scientists who had served the Nazi regime, and in many cases were directly tied to war crimes, into the United States. These were not men of theory alone. They were the architects of the Nazi war machine's darkest innovations, from V-2 rockets to chemical weapons. From hypobaric pressure chambers to experiments designed to manipulate human psychology. They had worked across fields where science blurred into cruelty. They were enemies, officially, and yet, at the same time, they held the key to the future. The operation's name came from something deceptively simple, a paperclip attached to a file. Those paperclips marked dossiers belonging to individuals with Nazi pasts. Names were selected, records were cleaned, histories were rewritten, and then, under newly constructed identities, they were transferred to America. In short, the past was being erased, and the future was being recoded. Instead of standing trial in courtrooms, these scientists were placed in laboratories on American soil, and it didn't stop at simply bringing them in. They were given salaries, homes, security. Their families were relocated alongside them. America offered them more than refuge. It offered them a new life. But why? Because what mattered in the real war was not which flag it was fought under. It was who held which knowledge. And if gaining that knowledge meant bargaining with the devil, then being cold-blooded enough to make that bargain became a requirement. The American government didn't merely extend forgiveness. It rebuilt these men into something else. They weren't just assigned a role. They were given a stage, and on that stage their pasts were kept hidden from the audience, so the war had not truly ended. Only the sides had changed, and the enemies were back on stage, wearing new costumes. The Nazi engineers who went to the moon. Some people leave traces on battlefields, others leave them in the sky. And the irony of history is this: some of the marks that rose into the heavens were born in the darkest places underground. Wernher von Braun is the embodiment of that irony. Born in Germany, he was fascinated by rockets from an early age, but his obsession was never just scientific curiosity. Von Braun became one of the Nazi regime's most favored engineers. He was placed in charge of Hitler's long-range weapons dream. And in the end, he developed the V-2 rockets, widely considered the first ballistic missiles in human history. The V-2 was not merely a technical breakthrough. It was one of the most merciless weapons of the war. Launched at London, Antwerp, and beyond. These rockets killed hundreds of innocent people. But the darker truth lies beneath the surface. They were built underground, meters below the earth, beneath the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp where forced laborers were held. Thousands of prisoners were driven to work in brutal conditions. Many never survived. So, von Braun's dream of reaching space was built on human lives. When the war ended, many assumed von Braun would be held accountable. They were wrong. He never faced the Nuremberg trials. Instead, the American government extracted him from Germany. Quietly, efficiently, and with purpose. And only months later, he was developing rockets for the U.S. Army in New Mexico. Over time, von Braun's past began to fade, carefully, strategically. His years under the Nazi regime were reframed as work done out of necessity. And before long, he was transformed into America's space hero. Under von Braun's leadership, the United States developed the Saturn V rocket. That rocket carried Apollo 11 in 1969. And inside the engine systems that carried Neil Armstrong to the moon was the signature of a former Nazi engineer. It was a triumph that seemed to smile at history. But beneath that triumph was a contradiction, hidden behind a mask. And von Braun was not alone. Many scientists brought to America under paperclip took key roles in the U.S. space program. Arthur Rudolph, for example, played a major role in the development of the V-2 program. In the United States, he received awards for exceptional service. But when his past resurfaced decades later, he was forced to give up his U.S. citizenship in the 1980s and was sent back to Germany. Another name, Kurt Debus, a Nazi Party member with documented ties to the Gestapo. And yet in the 1960s, he became the first director of the Kennedy Space Center. So they didn't just build technology, they built institutions. And the American public never fully learned who the real figures behind these success stories were. The press was either kept in the dark or chose silence, because society was never meant to question the pasts of the space age's symbolic heroes. Instead, headlines were printed. American ingenuity reached the moon. But no one asked where that ingenuity had been forged. Because the truth was this: America's doorway to space had been built in the laboratories of the Third Reich. And that leaves us with a disturbing, yet essential, question. If an achievement has dark origins, should it still be celebrated? Silent deals, science, morality, and intelligence. A new rivalry was rising in the post-war world. America and the Soviets would not fight this war with rifles and tanks, but with knowledge, with science, with minds. And the most strategic weapons of this era were not machines. They were people, more precisely, human brains. The secret operation known as Operation Paperclip became the front line of that new conflict. The scientists brought in from Nazi Germany didn't merely produce technology. They were integrated directly into America's defense and intelligence systems. These were not ordinary engineers. Many had conducted human experiments during the Nazi era. Many had worked inside concentration camps. Many had signed their names beneath research that should never have existed. Yet their dark past was pushed aside in the face of what America wanted most: their knowledge. Paperclip was not just a transfer, It was a cleansing operation. Before these men entered the United States, their records were made suitable. Accusations were removed. Histories were minimized. Certain facts were simply erased. New identities were created. New passports issued. New narratives written. And with that, they became neutral scientists, ready to serve America. But neutrality was never truly possible, because what they carried was not only rocket technology, it was also the memory and methodology of experiments conducted on the human mind. This is where the CIA entered the story. Some of the scientists brought through Paperclip became linked to MK Ultra, one of the Cold War's most controversial programs. MK Ultra was the name given to experiments focused on mind control. But what it truly represented was something darker: the systematic destruction of ethical boundaries, hypnosis, LSD, sensory deprivation, electric shock, techniques applied without people being informed and sometimes without consent, were carried out under the protection of the state. These experiments became a hidden form of violence, not only in wartime, but against citizens in times of peace. And some of the methods behind this violence had roots in Nazi laboratories. So why did it happen? Because while America claimed to defend freedom, it began to see every weapon as legitimate against its enemy. Paperclip became the silent witness to that moral transformation. These scientists were not valued for morality. They were valued for utility. What mattered was what they knew, not what they had done. And so the system built a new kind of legitimacy within itself. Not conscience, but advantage. Scientific progress was placed above ethical limits, and perhaps that is why Paperclip became more than a post-war program. It became one of the modern era's deepest contradictions. A nation that believed it had won the war had, in reality, injected its enemy's methods into its own body. But accepting that truth means questioning the very idea of victory. And some victories only look like victories because they are told that way. Reset identities, erase documents. Can a person's past be erased? And if a state does it systematically, then the truth of that past becomes less important than control over it. Operation Paperclip did not only bring scientists to America, it reshaped their histories. These men were not transferred only physically. They were reborn, legally and historically. Documents were edited, reports were reduced, files were sealed behind national security. Others vanished entirely. Individuals implicated in war crimes were integrated into the American system under new identities. Some were granted U.S. citizenship outright. Some took academic positions at universities. Others stepped into roles within institutions like NASA. And soon the details disappeared. Which camp they worked in, which project they contributed to, what they developed, whom they used as test subjects. It was no longer known, because it was not meant to be known. The process was so effective that some Paperclip scientists were presented as heroes of science in America. Their names appeared in children's books. Their success stories filled popular magazines. Yet the foundation of those successes had been built on inhumane experiments. Knowledge extracted from concentration camps was now fueling America's prestige projects, the so-called Land of Freedom. But the contradiction was made invisible through careful editing. New institutions formed after the war rewrote biographies from the beginning. In government offices, in academic circles, even in public encyclopedias, you could not find a single word about these names' Nazi pasts. Because Paperclip reshaped more than people, it reshaped history. Some documents never surfaced. Some files remained sealed for decades under the label classified. Even today, parts of the archives remain closed to researchers. And when it comes to individuals connected to projects like MKUltra, the details are still incomplete. Who did what? In which experiment? Where did the information come from? Some of those questions remain unanswered. This deliberate blackout reveals something unsettling: how state logic truly operates. In the modern world, where we assume everything is recorded, some documents are erased with surgical precision, and that leads to a haunting question. If the trace of knowledge is erased, is that knowledge truly gone? Or has it simply become a secret, reserved for those allowed to know it? In history, what is not written can be just as decisive as what is written. The paperclip files showed what America was willing to overlook in order to protect its narrative. If truths were shameful, they were suppressed. And over time, those suppressed truths disappeared into the dark corners of history, forgotten, or made to be forgotten. And that creates a new reality. If the past can be erased, how authentic can the future be? The price of victory. Who chooses the truth? History is often told through the lens of the winners. But being the winner is not defined only by battlefield success. Sometimes what defines victory is something else. Who hides the truth? And who decides what can be seen? Operation Paperclip was never just the transfer of a few scientists. It played a decisive role in rebuilding America's post-war identity and its future. The race to space, the expansion of intelligence, breakthroughs in military technology. So much of it was built on minds whose pasts had been erased, but that progress came at a cost. America presented itself as a superpower defending freedom and human rights, while integrating individuals implicated in Nazi crimes into its own system. This was not an accident, it was a choice, and it wasn't merely the crossing of an ethical line. It was a decision about truth itself: who gets to choose it, when it is revealed, and how it is told. Because what makes a narrative powerful is not only what it includes, but what it leaves out. Paperclip was both a war of knowledge and an act of memory engineering. America erased these names' pasts, dressed them in new identities, and turned them into the heroes of the future. Yet the question remains: if the past can be rewritten, how solid is today's truth? We try to understand history through documents, testimonies, and academic research, but sometimes the real truth isn't inside the documents, it's in what was removed. Some archives are never opened, some names are never spoken, some questions are never asked. Because silence is not emptiness, silence is structure. And perhaps that is why Paperclip should not be seen only as a historical event, but as an ongoing responsibility. Because decisions like these shape more than one era. They shape generations. They shape not only technology, but memory itself. It is not easy to question the price behind scientific progress, but difficulty does not make it unnecessary. Because sometimes a society's maturity is measured not by its achievements, but by its courage to confront its past. So what about us? Are we among those who choose the truths, or do we accept what is presented and live inside a story that was selected for us? The shadow of Operation Paperclip is still with us, and perhaps the most important question remains unanswered. Who really won the war? And that victory was one in whose name? Operation Paperclip showed us what governments are willing to hide in the name of power. But sometimes, The strangest secrets aren't locked in archives. Sometimes they appear in plain sight. Next, the Green Children of Woolpit.